Okay, so hello and welcome to everyone to tonight's webinar. My name is Aidan McKeeker, one of the project officers at the International Association of Political Science Students in the Oceania region. On behalf of the IAPSS Oceania region project team, I'm delighted to introduce this publication workshop, How to Transform a Thesis into a Journal Article. Tonight, our speakers are Professor Mark Beeson, who is of the University of Western Australia. Professor Beeson has taught IR in several universities in Australia and in the United Kingdom. He's also the founding editor of Critical Studies in Asia Pacific and has published in the Australian Journal of International Affairs. Also joining and hosting this event is Spiros Parthenis, an editorial board member of the IAPSS political science journal Politikon. This event will run for approximately 1 hour, with Professor Beeson's presenting for the first 15 to 20 minutes or so, followed by Spiros for another 15 or so minutes. We'll allow roughly 10 to 15 minutes for questions, which Spiros will conduct. A reminder that all audience members can participate with questions using the chat option on Zoom. And furthermore, this event will be recorded and made publicly available for global IAPSS members. Spiros, Mr. Beeson, you may begin.
Thanks very much, Aidan, and thanks for inviting me along to give a little talk about this sort of thing, because it's interesting and important, and I'm guessing your main audience will be people who are currently PhD students and hoping to turn their projects into articles and those kinds of things. So I'll say a little bit about it. In some ways, I'm not the best person to do this because my own writing style is somewhat idiosyncratic, and my entire academic trajectory has been a bit unorthodox. But anyway, I'll tell you what I know about it and think about it, and you can see what use you can make of it. But one thing to think about at the outset is that if you don't enjoy writing and you don't it doesn't fill your heart with joy at the prospect of doing it, you're probably in the wrong business, because if you're going to be an academic, you're going to spend an awful lot of time reading, writing, thinking about the whole business. And if you find writing difficult and painful, don't do it. There are plenty of other jobs that it doesn't sort of hinge on doing that. So you might be better advised doing that. But if you do enjoy it, it's a great way of making a living, and it's a good outlet for doing something that you enjoy. So there's all that to be said about it. When you're thinking about the good news for you, if you're doing a PhD and you're doing research at the moment, is you've got something that people are interested in, want to hear about, and you probably know more about than anybody else, possibly in the world, depending on what your particular topic is. But at the moment, when you've just finished your thesis or near to finishing your thesis, or you've done some decent research, you've got something that people want to hear about. And so this is your big opportunity to make a bit of a name for yourself and get things out and get publishers interested in the kind of things that you're doing. Because one of the things that publishers are interested in doing, which Spiros will say more about in a moment, no doubt, is publishing new material that's cutting edge, fresh, research that nobody's done before. All those things are very attractive. I used to edit a journal myself, and I recognize that when things come in that look something you don't know too much about it and it looks novel and interesting, it's a big selling point. So that's something to think about, that make the most of it while your research is fresh and not too many other people are competing in that kind of space. Now, I have to say, I've been asked to comment on research design, and if you've ever had the dubious distinction of reading my work, you'll know that research design is not something I'm normally associated with, and there are different ways of going about writing journal articles and different audiences that want to hear about the sorts of things that you do, and journals and journal editors are often attracted to some types of articles rather than others. So one of the things you need to do is to think about who your audience is, what kind of things they might be interested in seeing, and the kind of style and format they want to see it in. And that's really important to recognize the kind of style that different journals go in for. And I personally make a point of not submitting articles to some journals, because I know that on ideological grounds, on style grounds, on methodological grounds, they won't be remotely interested in the sort of things that I say or the sort of approach that I take. And there will be, particularly American political science journals, they will be aghast at the absence of quantitative material and rigorous types of pseudo-scientific methodology. Now, some people can do that, and if you can, good luck to you, because there's a lot of American political science journals that are very prestigious, very famous, and if you can do that kind of stuff, they'll love it. That's a big plus. And for me, it's not even worth me sending my work there, because if it hasn't got regression analysis and many of these other kinds of things that have become very influential and prominent in American political science journals, they're not going to be terribly interested or impressed. So bear that in mind. Think about where you're going to send your stuff and the kinds of reception that it's likely to get from the editors of those journals and the kinds of things that they like. And there's one easy way to find out what journals like. Read the journal. What kind of stuff do they publish? What kind of approach do the people who get published in those journals take? And what would you need to do to get your work published in that sort of journal? And if you don't think you fit, you probably don't. And the other thing to think about is that some journals, quite a few journals, in fact, especially if they're any good, are looking for reasons to reject your work, basically. So if you send your work to International Organization or American Political Science Review or some of these other kind of journals, their rejection rate is about 95%. So the chances of getting into these journals are pretty slim, even if you're absolutely brilliant, do everything they want, and your research is cutting edge, especially if you're starting out in the business. It's pretty hard. I've never sent anything to IO because I've got a pretty shrewd idea what they do with it. So it's kind of worth thinking about where you're likely to get things published. Now, if you're at the beginning of your career, you might have a sporting chance of getting some your original research published in decent journals, because, as I say, you've got a bit of a comparative advantage for a little while. But it's worth thinking about just getting published full stop. There's plenty of places you can get things published. Not at all of them are academic journals. There are plenty of things like The Conversation, and people run different blogs for different particular research interests. Just get stuff published in those. Some of them may not be that prestigious. They may not be that great for getting you a job down the track, but they're good for getting your name out there. They're good for your self-confidence. You think you're actually doing something. You've got a few things to put on your CV. And at this stage of your career, you want a few things to put on your CV, even if they're not fantastic, even if it's not an article in IO. It's not the end of the world. Pad your CV out a bit in the early stages, just so it demonstrates that you're capable of getting stuff published somewhere, and you know how the kind of game works, that you are aware of the importance of publishing, and you can get stuff done. So there's plenty of places you can start off that may not be academic journals, but it's worth doing it just because it's something to do, get your name out, and you'll feel better about it. So it's kind of good. I've done plenty of that, probably too much in my career, but it's kind of interesting. And sometimes you get a bit of useful feedback, and you kind of get to know people, and they might suggest things that you can do. And once you get a few things published, you'll be surprised. You'll get invited to publish in other outlets. And edited books have, there are mixed views about edited books and the merits of publishing in edited books. Some of them are great. If they're published by a prominent university press with a famous editor, absolutely accept any invitation you may get to take part of them, even offer your services. Some other edited books aren't quite as impressive and won't do your career quite as much good, but they're still worth appearing in, particularly at this stage of your career, and they're much easier to get published in than a prominent journal where the refereeing process can be pretty rigorous. And as I say, editors are often looking for a reason to turn you down, basically, because they've got more material than they can possibly handle. So that's worth thinking about as well. The other thing about sending stuff to journals, of course, is that you've got to have a pretty thick skin in this business, because you'll get rejected. That just kind of goes with the territory. Don't take it personally. It's par for the course. I've been rejected by more journals I can possibly remember over the years, but I don't worry about it too much. I just regard it as being their loss, of course. So, but seriously, you will get rejected, and it's not a great experience. But if you send stuff to a decent journal, they'll have good, prominent referees, we hope, and if they're any good, they'll take the trouble to tell you why the article its strengths and weaknesses, and they'll give you some useful feedback, and then you can work your way down the hierarchy of journals and send it to the next journal on the list. And you, perhaps with the benefit of some rigorous refereeing, you'll have a better idea of what to expect, what was missing in the original, and a better chance of getting it published in a slightly less prestigious journal, perhaps. So think about that and don't worry about getting rejected too much. When you're actually submitting journal articles, in particular, when you are starting off, do, as I say, think about what the journal publishes, and every journal will have a little style guide, and that's one of the most irritating things in the publishing business, in my humble opinion. Every journal seems to insist on a completely different referencing system with the most arcane, stupefying and irritating insistence on nuanced references that can't be possibly understood by any sane human being. However, if that's what the journal wants, that's what you've got to do. There's absolutely no point in sending the thing in if it's not properly formatted, if it's not properly referenced in the way that the journal requires. Because the journal, as I say, is probably looking for a reason to turn you down. And this is a pretty easy one. If you can't be bothered to read the directions and instructions about how to format your work, they won't take you seriously. And why should they? So that's worth thinking, because it's an easy thing to do. So just make sure you follow all of the things you're being asked to do. And actually submitting the things to journal publication sites these days, that's a pain in the arse as well. But unfortunately, it's something else you've got to do. And you've got to struggle with the things, and it is one of the most tedious and irritating things you can possibly think of. But if you get a result, you get the thing published, it's all worthwhile. So it's kind of something you got to think about and something you got to put up with, I'm afraid. So make sure your work fits, present it properly. If you're not a native speaker, try and develop a friendship with a chum who is a native speaker and is willing to go through it for you and just get rid of some of the more egregious mistakes and grammatical problems, just so that it reads reasonably well. And that's worth thinking about as well. I've been spending the day reading student essays, not a happy experience always, but there are always some classic things that students fail to do, apart from all the referencing and all that kind of stuff. Just give your essays some structure, make sure that the prospective reader knows what this is going to be about, what the point of it is, what your kind of bit of value added is to the debate. Nobody's expecting you to completely reinvent the theoretical or conceptual framework of the entire discipline that you're a part of, but they are expecting to make a bit of a contribution and to recognize where you fit into that kind of ongoing discussion. And if you're smart, you'll reference quite a few of the publications from the journal that you're targeting, because there's nothing delights an editor's heart more than to see their journal being cited frequently in the appropriate literature. So play the game and make sure you cite some of the people from that journal and you get into a discussion with that. And you'll see some of the American journals are notorious for this. International Security, International Organization. If you don't review the last 20 years history of publications in that area by the journal, you're not in the game, basically. It's tedious and time consuming and a bit of a waste of time in my view, but you've got to do it. It's part of the game. So recognize that and recognize what you need to do to play that game successfully. So yes, I think I've made a few points about, oh yeah, one thing, when you're writing, it depends kind of what the format is. And as I say, different journals have different styles, and there are different, more serious kinds of approaches to different sort of genres of writing. But one thing to do is, even for a journal article that's, reasonably sort of erudite and intimidating, try it out on a chum. Get your mum to read it, whoever it might be. Get somebody to read it. Maybe they're not going to be an expert in the area. It'd be surprising if they were, but just see if they can make sense of it. And if they start glazing over after 5 minutes, well, that's your problem, not theirs. Even a well-intentioned, bright reader should be able to understand what you're trying to say and shouldn't find it too much of a chore to actually engage with it. So if you can make your work engaging, if you can get the reader in some way, so, you know, good titles, good introduction, good abstract, those kinds of things, they're all important ways of attracting attention. And this goes for the editors of journals as well. They're going to look at your abstract, look at the beginning, get just a bit of a sense, and they probably might not read the whole thing. I mean, to be brutal about it, they might just get a bit of a feel about it, see if it fits. If it doesn't, they might give you what's known as a quote-unquote desktop reject. And that's not the worst thing that can happen to you, because if they are going to reject your work, it's much better they do it in 24 hours and send it back to you and say, not really our kind of thing, than keeping it for 3 months and then telling you that they didn't like it after all. They're not going to send it out to reviewers, because that really is a pain. And that's happened to me recently, and I wasn't very impressed. But that's something you're going to put up with, because editors have the power. They're the gatekeepers, and they can accept or deny your ability to publish your work. So you've got to humor them, unfortunately, and play that kind of game. So if you get a revise and resubmit, that's a good result. So that's not bad at all. So it means they've looked at your work, the referees have looked at your work, the referees have found some merit in it, so they haven't just said to the editor, this is awful, you should never send it out to review, which I'm afraid I've done a couple of times myself as a referee, because if you get something that's badly prepared, the English is difficult to follow, it's just slapdash and amateurish, why would you want to read your paper, waste your time reading it? Because the time of referees is valuable as well. So don't irritate them gratuitously either when you're preparing stuff. So if you get a revise and resubmit, that's great, because it means in principle, the editors and the reviewers have found things in your work that's potentially worthy of being published. And the better the journal is, the better that kind of feeling is about getting a revise and resubmit. So when you get one of these, you should get some clear indication from both the referees and maybe the editors as well about precisely what they would like you to do to make this article fit with their journal and make it worthy of publishing. So what you've got to do is to follow their instructions. They're not telling you this for fun or just for something to do or to show off. Sometimes they're doing that as well, but follow their instructions. And when you resubmit, you include a letter stating precisely what you've done. I tend to do it in bullet point form because I can't be bothered to do it in exhaustive form, I'm afraid, because it doesn't mean that much to me. It means a lot to you at your stage of the career. I mean, if I get turned down, even on a revise and resubmit, I'll be irritated, but it's not career death for me. Whereas for you, you want to get that thing in the journal. So you send in a letter with your revise and resubmit that states precisely what you've done, why you did it, and how it answers the criticisms or the suggestions of the referees or the editors. So what you want to do is to give them absolutely no excuse whatsoever to reject your paper after they've invited you to resubmit it. So you do exactly what they want. And that's part of the game as well. And it might kind of change your paper a bit in ways that you might not be entirely happy with sometimes. But if you get the thing published, that's the name of the game. So, and that's what's going to get you a job further down the line as well. So anything I've forgotten to, so yes, just make sure you think about the journal, think about what they want, think about the style, think about what you're adding, and just make it as accessible as you can. So anyway, I think that's probably enough to be going on with, but happy to take a few questions if you got.
Thank you, Professor Beeson, for that. We'll move on to Spiros.
Hello everyone. Just a bit to introduce myself. I'm a member of the editorial board of Politikon journal, about for a year now. I'm in my PhD, my second year. I am in the area of tourism and politics. So I'm going to talk to you a bit. Professor Beeson, of course, has covered me in most of the aspects of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about a bit about the how to structure your article, and then how to choose ideal, let's say, journal for your article. Regarding the IAPSS Politikon journal, maybe most of you are familiar with the requirements that the journal has for you to submit an article. I would invite you to read them very carefully, because this is very important. This is the very first step that you should take into consideration. So regarding the structure now of the article, of course, first it's the abstract, which should be give all the information necessary for your research, how the relevance of your research. Of course, the title and the abstract are connected, how your research contributes to existing knowledge in your field, and you should also include 5 or 6 appropriate keywords for the reader, so that to give them a gist for what is your article will be about, actually. So then we have the introduction and the background information. You should say, this is what we know as the literature review. So you should state what is already known in your subject, in your area, and how your research is going to fill in this research gap, let's say. You should present your research questions. Of course, they should be clearly defined, and followed probably by the corresponding hypothesis that you should verify later. Then we can move on to the methodology, or the method section, which I consider this is one of the most important sections of the article, where you present your research design. So you present the framework of your research and what techniques and procedures you're going to use to choose in your article. Broadly, we know everyone that we have broadly classified as quantitative, qualitative, or a mixed method research. That should be clear in your paper. Of course, we have other types of classifications. You should say if your research is descriptive, experimental, correlational, or diagnostic. So, but you can find out all of these in every textbooks. Also, it depends on what stage you are in your thesis. That could be a master's thesis dissertation or a PhD thesis dissertation, though. So it depends on what stage you are. If you are in the still in the early, maybe in the early steps, maybe you should not consider sending your manuscript. But of course, you can. A political journal is ideal for that, because we welcome students. So students' essays, articles, and we are very welcome to review them and to send our comments and remarks so that they can improve their manuscript. So then, regarding the structure now, after the methodology, we can go to the results section, results and discussion of results, which is also very important. If you have quantitative findings, you should present them in a separate section. If you have qualitative findings, maybe you should also put them in a different section. Or, of course, you could produce several articles, so you can turn some part of your research, let's say PhD thesis, into 2 or 3 small articles, not just one. But that depends on the topic, on the length of your dissertation, of your thesis, and many other factors. So the results, in the results section, you should discuss to what extent are the results similar or different from those in other studies, in other similar studies in your area. You should state if the results confirm or reject your initial hypothesis, and to explain if you found what you really expected to. Then we go to the conclusions section, which is also important. You should summarize your research. You should say if the aims of the study have been fulfilled, and if the references and the results support these conclusions and findings. Also, you should state the limitations of your research, if there are any. Also, I would say you should make sure that the article is correct, has the correct formatting and referencing style according to the journal style. So you should check the journal's website guidelines for authors. So also all references should appear in the bibliography. All references cited in the text should appear in the bibliography and vice versa, something which do not find very often. Students often fail to do either of these things. Try also to include relevant and recent references. That's very important. If you cannot have references, the 10% of your references should be from the last 5 years, and then the 80–90% should be older. No, there should be a balance. So also, you should also make sure that you have the necessary copyright clearance, the necessary permission to edit, to use actually third-party material sources. That could be everything. It could be an image, that could be a screenshot, whatever. Of course, plagiarism, is very important. You should be aware of these, as it can be easily detected, and you should inspire trust and reliability in your studies. So you should check for any plagiarism cases, even if it's not voluntary. Another important aspect of of an article is the validity. With the validity, it depends on doing a qualitative or quantitative research. The main criteria actually for quantitative is validity and reliability. So you should fulfill these two criteria and present that to the reader. I will move on to how to spot or how to choose, let's say, the best journal for your article. I think one of the safest, let's say, one of the safest criteria is to see your references, your bibliography. How many times, what are the journals that you have most often referenced, that you have most often used? These might be, probably might be the best journals for you to consider first. So there will be of course, you should read the aims and scope in the website of the journal to see if it fits but from your reading, doing your master's thesis or your PhD thesis, you will see that you come up with specific journals. So it must be them that they are the most suitable for you. So you should check if your article suits with the targeted journal. Also, as Professor Beeson said, maybe you should, or maybe sometimes the journals ask for it, a cover letter where you explain in more detail why they should publish your research, what is the originality, let's say, of your research. and why it might be of interest to the journal's readers. There, of course, also, yes, you have to say that you have no conflicts of interest, yes, to disclose. Also, grammar and spelling is very, very important, the level of English. You should check if the journal asks for British or American spelling. This is also important. In case your article is accepted conditionally, and they ask you for certain revisions, you should read very carefully what the reviewers have written, and you should apply them. If your paper is rejected, then you should see why was your paper rejected. Was it because of the language? Was it because of the topic? Was it because it didn't suit the aims and scope of the journal? Was it because there was no solid theoretical framework to support it? So you should take that into consideration before submitting to the next journal. Yes, so that means, yes, think carefully when to submit next. So I think that wraps up a bit of, I don't know if there's anything else I would say. I would be happy to take up any questions from participants. The floor is yours, Aidan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Spiros. Very good insights there. I'd like to interject here to introduce Dana Rice, the Senior Editor of Politikon, and Max Stewart, the Politicon's Editor-in-Chief. Dana?
Thank you very much for the introduction, Aidan, and to our speakers for their wonderful discussions. So I just want to bring up a few opportunities with Politicon. So first of all, with submissions to Politicon, we have multiple submission types, and I've included a link in the chat if you're interested in reading further. And I also wanted to bring up, if you're interested in becoming a reviewer for Politicon, we're always interested in more reviewers, having people from different fields. So if you're interested, you can also go to our website and submit an application to become a reviewer. And the final thing I wanted to mention was that we are looking for a new editorial assistant from Africa, so that we can have more of a regional specialist. So if you are from Africa, if you can demonstrate a strong connection to Africa, we would be very interested in receiving an application from you. So I will also post that in the chat. And I think maybe our Editor-in-Chief, Max Stewart, had a few things he'd like to add. So I'll pass over to him.
Yes, hello everyone, and I'd like to thank both the IAPSS Oceania team and my colleagues from the Politikon editorial team, Spiros and Dana here, as well as Andres Acosta, for working on this webinar. Of course, special thanks to Professor Beeson for your very, I think, important and valuable introduction to how junior scholars and students as well can sort of break into academic publishing. And I just thought to add a few remarks on the philosophy of IAPSS Politikon, which is a quite special journal in a sense that it is a junior academic journal, right? So it is not a journal that is managed by senior scholars, but as you could see already here, it is managed by junior scholars. And of course, it has a senior international advisory committee of senior scholars who advise us, who help us in cases of need and consult any issues that might arise. But the model is therefore different from both senior journals that we have in the discipline, and Professor Beeson mentioned a number of them, as well as so-called student journals, right? Journals which are basically usually based on a university or a research institution, and where students are involved, but they are usually involved only from one institution. So Politikon, in that sense, is very international and tries to bridge those two categories of journals, among others, to address some of those problems that Professor Beeson highlighted. So if you are a junior scholar, you will face a number of difficulties, for instance, with these journal style guides, right, which were mentioned, that it is very difficult to adjust to a specific journal style guide. Now in Politikon, we have introduced, alongside only very few other senior journals in the discipline, format-free submission, which means that you don't need to worry about a specific referencing style at the time when you are submitting to the journal, which is, I think, a great advantage in case you, for instance, don't have a research assistant, or you don't have time to spend a day on just reformatting the references, particularly if the journal's referencing style is something that is in no referencing format standards that, that can be used with computer applications. So this is one advantage that the journal has brought in. Another one is precisely that Professor Beeson mentioned, the English language review. So we do, of course, require that the initial submission has certain language standards, but we don't stipulate the requirement of proofreading by a native speaker if you are not a native speaker as the author before submission. I think this is an important advantage because we do see, and we actually receive a lot of submissions from authors whom we could say are from disadvantaged academic environments where there are not so many resources to provide, for instance, for this proofreading, or there are other limitations, for instance, access to academic sources. This is not evident that everyone doesn't have access to the references, to the literature, which is very often behind paywalls. So this is something we also consider, and in fact our editorial team and Spiridon is particularly important in that regard as well, helps then with proofreading of accepted manuscripts, those which pass the academic review standards, right? So these are, I just thought to mention these points as some of the distinguishing elements of Politikon as opposed to some of the senior journals, which then enable also junior scholars, of course, PhD students, but also master students, and even undergraduates, although usually undergraduate papers will not pass the review process, but at least they will receive valuable feedback, right? And in some cases, they also pass because, of course, the evaluation is not based on the level of studies or the level of seniority of the scholar. So we, in fact, employ a triple-blind review process, which prevents even the editorial board members who provide the initial evaluation to know the identity of the authors, right? So the level of studies is not known and then cannot serve even as an implicit bias in the evaluation process, which again is another advantage. And maybe a final point to highlight is precisely, again, Professor Beeson mentioned that some journals in the discipline which are senior are orientated towards particular research methods, right, or particular methodologies, and they are exclusive towards, for instance, qualitative analysis. So this is certainly not the case for Politikon. In fact, we do publish a little bit more on the qualitative side, but we are definitely open to all different research traditions, research methodologies, approaches. We are not restricted in that sense. So I think that sort of embodies the idea of a general political science journal. Of course, that has a number of challenges we may discuss if someone is interested, but it is really the idea to be open towards all the possible subfields and approaches, which is not the case with many senior journals that do profile themselves as general political science journal or general IR journal, but in fact, they are exclusive or more exclusive towards some methodologies. And I will post in the chat a link to a webinar which we conducted last year on the philosophy of the journal, where you can find out more also about these more conceptual underpinnings of how our journal works. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, both Dana and Max. We do have a question that came in from Firat F, and I apologize if I made a mispronunciation of your name. So Firat is from the Political Science MA program, University of Wrocław, Poland, and he has put in the question: I have recently submitted my MA thesis, and following that, I have started transforming it into an article. At first, my purpose was to join a conference next year, and this I could do rather easily. However, I'm finding the task of limiting my observations for publication to be somewhat harder. My topic covers various aspects of societal change over a large time span. I feel the need to reduce the number of observations I present at the expense of quality of the paper. In a thesis, it is possible to go into further details, obviously, but reducing these observations proved to be problematic. I'd like to ask for advice on that, and thank you a lot. So Professor Beeson, I'll start with you.
Sure. Without knowing exactly what the article's about, it's a bit hard to say. But the general proposition that you've got a large thesis of some description with a lot in it, and you want to get some of the value out of that and condense it into an article form. That's a pretty common problem. With PhD thesis, it might be slightly easier in some ways, because if you have a clear chapter structure to the thesis, each chapter potentially lends itself to being topped and tailed, as they say in the trade, and can be turned into a journal article with some facility. An MA thesis might be a little bit different, because they're usually a bit shorter, and so the difficulty of changing that into a journal article might be a little bit higher. But the key point, as ever, is what's it about? What's the point you want to make? Do you really need to have endless series of possibly duplicated observations about similar sorts of things to make that point clear? Could you footnote some of the possibly reasonably well-known empirical observations and material that you don't need to regurgitate in exhaustive detail to make that point? So there are often ways around this, and the readability of the end product might be significantly improved by not having exhaustive digressions on fairly small aspects of an overarching and possibly more important and interesting argument. So it's a question of judgment, and you get better at it as you go along, hopefully. But yes, think about, again, what the point is that you're trying to make, and what might be of most interest to the journal that you've got in mind to send it to.
Thank you very much for that. Spiros, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I fully agree with Professor Beeson. Yes, I think...
For God's sake. Do call me Mark.
Call me, okay, Mark. Yes, I should say that I would suggest that you should construct a piece that could stand on its own. Yes, too many details are not necessary. That could be in an appendix or in something at the end of the article. This is the ability when you submit for an article to condense the content of your thesis. And then you could prove really, if you can condense and put in a, well, I don't know the word, of course you should know the word count, the word limit of the journal, the article. So if you can condense your research in 6,000, 7,000 words, that is, I think you can say everything in that. The reader does not need to know everything, every aspect of your, okay, you can describe how you did the research, but they should not know every source, every detailed source and so on. So the important is to try to see if they can isolate a part, a chunk of the thesis into a standalone piece, or try to condense with logic. That our friend here should find the logic behind this and to present it in a coherent way. Yes, I agree with Mark, not many digressions. That should be tiring for the reader. So that's it.
Thank you for that. We've just had another question from Manisha saying, I think it was a great lecture. I'm Manisha, I'm not a political science student. I have done my PhD in public health, and my topic was socioeconomic and health condition of women manual scavenger. I have covered some political aspects in my research. I have a question to Mark Beeson. Can you please guide some more for how and where we can publish? Thank you.
The topic, public health, have to say, I'm not a whiz on public health. I mean, it's a good topic to be interested in at the moment, because there's a lot of interest in health-related issues for fairly obvious reasons. But I mean, if you have a scout around in the journals, the point that Spiros was making earlier on about who do you cite most, which kind of journals crop up in your own work, you'll have a much better idea about the kind of journals in this area than I do, for sure, because I've never, well, actually, I have written something on public health, as it turns out, because everybody has these days because of coronavirus, but I don't know the journals well, and you probably have a much shrewder idea than I would. But just think about what kind of stuff are the journals you're reading publishing? Are they publishing similar sorts of people, articles, topics to you? What can you add to that literature that might be of interest to those journals? And the good news is if you think carefully about where to send it, then in principle, those editors, reviewers as well, will be interested in principle in what you're doing. If you've been doing something recent and up to date, they'll be even more interested, because that's one of the ways we figure out what's happening in the kind of areas we're interested in, because it's hard to keep on top of everything because there's so much stuff published, which is kind of good in a way. So you're doing them a favor if you're doing cutting edge, up-to-date work. So yes, just think about what the journals are in your area and the ones you read the most and find the most useful, and they'll probably be a good place to start.
Thank you for that. I've got a question from Nayela Elmo. Hello, do you have any advice regarding working with other authors on a paper, especially regarding the issue of cohesiveness and clarity?
I do. I'm a big fan of collaborating with other authors, and you'll be amazed and astounded to hear this, no doubt, but my great goal in life before I retire is to write with 50 other co-authors. I'm up to about 46, so I might get there, I'm not sure, but it's great fun. I've only ever had one really bad experience, and that was with somebody who's a friend of mine, but he's a bit bonkers, and he can be a bit hard to work with and has very fixed ideas about how things should be and what the right answer to particular questions is. Now, you might want to think about that before you choose your co-authors, because some co-authors are much easier to get on with, much more flexible and responsive to a collaborative process, and far less dictatorial. So think carefully about who you're going to write with, and be prepared to be a bit flexible. And it's a collaborative process. And the great thing about it is you get to do things that you wouldn't be able to do on your own. So I've written about quite a few topics, which I don't know a great deal about, to be perfectly honest, but I know enough to put a decent article together and to recognize the value in other people's work as well. So, you know, you get to add something to what they're doing, they get to add something to what you're doing, and it can be a really enjoyable and constructive process. So highly recommended, but just think carefully about who you're going to do it with and what they're going to get out of it and what you're going to get out of it as well.
Excellent. Spiros, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yes, well, I have some experience also, co-authored some chapters for a book. Yes, I think you need to know the other, but I think you can join the strong points of each one. So its strength, let's say strength lies within the union. You can take advantage, let's say, of the strong points of your co-author, and he or she should take advantage of your strong points, and that put it together. Of course, it's a matter of character, of course, if you match with the other, but I think it's very profitable. Yes, and it's something the project will be something that maybe you wouldn't be able to do it on your own. So yes, I also highly recommend it.
Thank you for that. Another question from Erman Ermahan, and I apologize again if I got your name mispronounced. Hello, thank you very much for this valuable webinar. My name is Erman, a PhD student from Kadir Has University in Istanbul, Turkey. I'd like to ask whether we can avoid self-plagiarism when we try to convert our thesis into an article. Mark?
I'm not even sure what that means, actually. I mean, if you wrote it and it's in your thesis, that's fine. You can recycle what's in your thesis. You might want to think about the question of, if you get your thesis published as a book, which should be something you might be thinking about doing at some stage, then there might be an issue about reproducing word for word what you had in your thesis and what might get published as a journal article or in some other form. That can be a bit of an issue, but generally it'll be in a different format. And this is possibly not good advice, but if you have a good idea, don't be afraid to say it more than once in more than one venue. So you might not get that many in the course of your academic life. So, and you'll find that you'll get identified as being an expert on something or other. And if you get invited to write contributions to books, edited books, which you probably will do once your name starts getting out there, they'll probably ask you to write something you've just finished writing, or just read your work in a journal somewhere and thought, that's good, we could do with a chapter on that in the book that we're currently editing. So they're going to ask you to write something that's a bit similar to what you've already done, probably. But at different stages of your career, that can be a good thing or a bad thing. But if when you're starting off, as I said, get some stuff out there, if somebody invites you to write a chapter for a book, particularly if they're well-known, famous, and it's likely to get decent circulation, absolutely jump on it and do it, because it's a kind of easy publication, relatively speaking, because it won't be that hard to do probably, because you'll be already on top of whatever the argument and literature might be. But you just got to be careful about, when you're a bit further down the track, you've got to be a bit more careful about accepting everything and saying yes to everything. You've got to be a bit more discriminating. Otherwise, you get overloaded and you can't fulfill all your commitments, and that's bad form, I think, as well. So you get a bit of a reputation. You've got to be a bit careful about that, because you want to have a kind of good reputation as being a reliable contributor and somebody who takes it seriously. And if you do, you'll be fine.
Excellent, thank you. And Spiros, do you have anything to add to that question?
Actually, I would say that maybe when self-plagiarism maybe refers to from journal article to journal article, not from the thesis to an article. So that you have already published a journal article, and then you write another one, and you use some of the things you wrote in the previous article. I think that's main, and not from the thesis to an article. I would say this is the difference for me.
Thank you very much for that contribution. If there's no other further questions, would any of the speakers, Dana, Max, Mark, or Spiros, like to add any further comments to the workshop?
No, I think it's a valuable thing to do, and don't be put off by getting rejections or occasional disappointments about sending things to swanky journals. I mean, it's just goes with the territory, I'm afraid. So you've got to have a bit of a thick skin in this business, but do, as a matter of course, write all the time. That's good advice. Sometimes you can write too much and publish too much as well. That can be a problem eventually. But writing all the time is a good habit to get into, and don't sort of get into the situation where you just find it hard to start and get going. And just if you're doing it all the time, you never kind of think about it. You just kind of churning stuff out. And so that's not a bad space to be in. Sometimes a bit of quality control can be an issue, but as I say, when you're starting off, I think too much is better than not enough in some ways. So yes, and it can be good fun as well. It's a great way of making a living if you can get a job. So, but one way of getting a job, get some stuff published. So it's part of the game.
And Spiros, do you have anything further to add?
No, actually, this read, and try to, to always summarize what you've read if you really understood it. Try to keep what's really interesting for you. This is a very good an ability that is that you should develop. Maybe you should read 20, 30 books, and this is a skill that is being developed progressively. You should read a lot. Maybe you should also keep a chunk. And what I noticed is that many books, authors often talk about the same topic and the same thing, but with a different terminology, of course, which is jargon. And then I thought, oh, that was what the other author said about, with the same thing, but with a different terminology. So, but you come to a point when everything is recycled, and then you really start to realize what's going on in your area, in your field. So read, and write. That's my advice.
Thank you very much, Spiros, for that. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this workshop. Thank you ever so much to Professor Beeson and Spiros for this engaging dialogue and taking the time to be here. And also a special thanks to Dana and Max for their contributions. To our attendees, thank you for watching, and thank you so much for your questions. And I hope you've all benefited from our workshop tonight. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to follow our social media accounts for upcoming events and to post feedback. Additionally, you can express your interest to become involved in the IAPSS on said mediums. And finally, thank you once again to our speakers tonight, and we are ever so grateful for your contribution and involvement. May we see you here again at IAPSS sometime soon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Can you send us a link to the recording when you do it?
We will. We shall.
Good on you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye. Bye-bye.